Hi, everyone. Today we have a very special episode for you. I'm joined by Dr. Chrisha Anderson, and we're going to be talking about podcasting, fandom, and academia. Chrisha, welcome to Carrying Wayward.
Yay, I'm so glad to be here. I'm so excited.
I'm so happy that you're here and that we finally get to talk.
I know. Thank you so much for having me.
It's genuinely my pleasure. Drew is very sad that he couldn't be here, but he got a job, so we're very happy for him.
Priorities, I suppose.
Yes, there you go. So for our listeners who may not know you, Dr. Chrisha Anderson is a licensed mental health therapist with a PhD in human behavior. Her doctoral research focused on the relationship between science fiction fandom and psychological well-being in women. And she currently works in private practice where she loves incorporating fiction and fandom into her clinical work. She's also a lifelong fangirl of different variety of genres, including television, film, gaming, and music. She's been a fan of Supernatural since finding the show in 2012 and co-hosts the Fangirl Business Podcast, which focuses on fandom dynamics, meta-analysis, and queer subtext for both Supernatural and the Winchesters. For all of our listeners who are looking for a Winchesters podcast,
here we are.
Yep. Is there anything else you want to add about like what you've been doing with your podcast or with anything else?
I think that about sums it up. I mean, we've been having a really good time, surprisingly, talking about the Winchesters. I was not anticipating that, but
those are such good surprises. I'm so happy about that.
Yeah, it's been a genuine delight to dig into it.
That's amazing. Honestly, I've been hearing like things here and there, and I feel like, I basically know what's happening, but I just haven't watched the series. So it's been an interesting fandom experience.
I bet, yeah.
So just to give listeners a little bit of context here, like I've just finished my first semester of my PhD program, and one of the topics in my doctoral seminar, which is basically a fancy way of saying like it was a course that taught us how to be PhD students. And one of the topics in that class was how challenging it is to cite some forms of knowledge like blogs or podcasts or even tweets, especially when we're using like citation styles like APA, MLA, Chicago, Vancouver, or whatever other style. And for me, the underlying message of those conversations that we had was that this kind of knowledge is basically not valued by academic systems. Right. And it sort of launched me into a spiral about like what it means to be creating this kind of knowledge that like you and I, Chrisha, but also like our co-hosts and other people, other creators in this fandom are creating so regularly on our podcasts. And for it to not be easy to cite and basically not valued by a very important aspect of my life anyway. Yeah. So since you're a part of like that Venn diagram of like fandom, podcasting, academia, we thought like, why not have this conversation with you?
Yeah.
So like, do you maybe want to get us started with telling me a little bit about like how you mixed like your academic and professional life with your fandom life?
It's sticky and kind of complicated, I would say. So when I was going through my PhD program and writing my dissertation, my goal at that point was essentially to go into academia. Like I wanted to be a professor. So I graduated in 2019, and the world sort of shifted a bit, I suppose we could say, in 2020.
Yes, I think that's a very mild way of putting it.
Yeah, understatement. So my plans, so in 2018, 2019, I was doing a lot of public speaking, like at fan conventions and things like that, talking about fandom and mental health, since that was my doctoral focus. And I felt good about that. It was fun to talk about it, to use my credentials to do that. I feel like that there's something about those letters that make people feel like what you're saying is more important, and so it gave some validity to some of the things that we love in fandom. And then I went into private practice, again, working with clients, which for me was just going to be temporary as I shifted into academia, but then the pandemic happened and academia has kind of been on fire, I would say, since then. Yeah. So I decided to stay in private practice. And I think that that's kind of where it's gotten murky for me, because clinical work is very private. You know, it's something that I really do try to keep away in some sense from my fandom life. And also during the pandemic, I struggled. And so I went to fandom for just me, like just Chrisha being there, hanging out, talking to people, because I was struggling and needed community, and community was in short supply during the pandemic. We were all at home. And so for me, that is also part of what made it murky, is that it stopped being about, academia or credentials or anything. Not that it ever was entirely, but it really shifted to being much more personal. And so I feel like I'm still kind of navigating that, because sometimes I just want to talk about silly things or pretty boys or whatever it is. And, but I feel like there can be that more emphasis put on words sometimes because of credentials. I know I get judged for things because I'm a therapist. And so it gets very, I don't know, difficult to figure out what expectations I have for myself, what expectations others have of me, and how I navigate that.
Right. Because you were saying that, you know, something about the letters at the end of your name that kind of like give more weight to what you're saying. And I mean, I don't have the letters yet. Hopefully one day, if I'm not part of the, I think 54% of PhD students who drop out.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, that's where we're at right now.
Yeah.
So I don't have those letters, but I definitely see a shift in the way that people trust the things that I tell them since starting this PhD program. And I think that I mean, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I think also because, you know, you're a therapist, like TM, there's probably also a lot of other things that are kind of attached to that. And like, how can you think that if you're a therapist? Or how can you possibly like have personal thoughts if you're a therapist? Like I don't know, I'm trying to understand that.
No, that's definitely it. There's a perception, I think, that therapist is my identity rather than my profession. And not just for me, but for all therapists that are, you know, anywhere on social media, that we're supposed to be kind of talking to everyone as if they're a client versus just talking to people. Like, I'm not always wearing my therapist hat. And if you're not a client, I'm not going to talk to you as if you are one, because that would be a lot of free labor that I just don't have capacity for.
It would also be unethical in so many ways.
So many ways. Yes.
So many ways. There was actually, I don't know if you are on TikTok at all, but there was this a very similar situation where a therapist who doesn't really market herself as a therapist online, but she happens to be a therapist in her profession, responded in a snarky way to somebody, and they're like, well, I can't believe that a therapist would respond this way. And she goes, well, I'm sorry, are you my patient? Are you my client? Like, is there something I didn't know about this relationship that you need to tell me? Like, So I think, so maybe like the boundaries of identity kind of become murky in those situations. And I come at it from a bit of a different perspective, right? Because I don't have that clinical work. And I had always kept like my fandom life very separate from my professional life, because for the past 3 years, I've been in a program that was like a scientific program, a health sciences program. And so there was that idea that anything that deviates from this kind of knowledge production that's done through very almost like, and I'm putting in very big quotation mark, but like the scientific method, because I don't really subscribe to that idea. It's the only way to create knowledge that is of any value. And so if I were to talk about my endeavors in fandom, I know, because it's happened before, that people are like, oh, that's nice. And just like completely, oh, that's nice. You know, like, oh, okay. All right. Okay. I can see that that's not something that you're interested in at all. But I sort of had like a bit of a shift this year where I tried to use, this in order to get like an award. It was a leadership award of some sort. And And I don't know if you can relate to this, but there was like this moment where I had written everything was complete, and I go, this is going to get dismissed so quickly. So quickly that I actually added a sentence in the letter that I wrote. And I'm just going to read this out to you.
Mm-hmm.
Often dismissed and sometimes mocked, fan communities bring together large amounts of people from all over the world in the mainstream and at the margins. And I was kind of, I didn't get the award, but I, but I felt like that I had to kind of defend what I was doing in a way that I wouldn't have had to defend it if it was working in a community center, for example. And I don't know if that's something that you've experienced at all in your...
Very much. Yeah, I would say that. So part of the reason that I went back to get my PhD, honestly, is because I found fandom. Like, I had been a fan forever, but it wasn't until 2013 that I found community in fandom that I felt comfortable in, which was Doctor Who fandom. And I met a lot of people who were, how do I want to say? I met a group of women. We all had similar interests. We were at similar life phases-ish. And I realized at that point, and this was very eye-opening for me, this is mid-30s, I have a master's degree, I have a career, that I could do things for fun.
Ooh.
That were not in service to other people, which sounds like a very obvious thing, but is simply not the environment that I was raised in. I did not understand that I didn't have to give everything to, the people around me, that I could do things for me. And so I did. I traveled to Vancouver to watch David Tennant filming something just on a whim. And it was like, this is amazing to connect with someone that I had not met in physical space. And we just got together and flew to another country to do something just for the heck of it. And it really sort of helped me understand the true value of these kinds of communities in a way that I think I always kind of knew, but just really drove it home for me. And in my master's program, where I became a licensed therapist, I felt like so many things were pathologized in that everything was looked at as a problem. All kind of human emotion was in some kind of way framed in these negative ways, up to and including like positive expressions of emotion. Like, I remember I had an intern client give me a hug, and I was told that was inappropriate because they shouldn't be expressing that to me. They should be expressing that to someone that they know, in their like family or their. And it was very confusing. It was like, wow, I have to be a robot that's outside of everything, and kind of all of these things are just bad that we have to fix. And so this idea of like joy and fun and just looking at things in such a different way is kind of what spurred me to want to go back to school and to study fandom and to give some scientific validity.
Yes, very good. I love the intonation that comes with that. Yes, I feel that very much. No need to say more.
And it was a battle. The whole time was a battle. Nobody understood what I was talking about. Yeah. And this is a human behavior PhD. It wasn't a counseling specific. It was a general human behavior. And it was just fight after fight after fight, trying to say and re-say what I wanted to do, because I was pushed to do these other more traditional things, or there was the stigma even there. And so, yeah, it was several years of having to say, no, I don't want to do it that way. No, that's not what I'm talking about. And it was exhausting. It really was.
I mean, that's also the thing, right? I feel like there's a lot of conflict in academia when it comes, especially, well, I'm talking about this as if this has been my entire life, but like just in my very short experience, I feel like there's a lot of conflict in making sure that your project gets done the way that you want it to get done, and that you get to see it through in the ways that you had imagined versus how other people kind of see it. And I think that that also speaks to what you were saying about you can just do things for fun. One thing that's sort of, and people don't understand when I say this, and I get why they don't understand it, but I don't know what I want to do after my PhD, because to me, my PhD is my current job that I love. I enjoy doing it. I don't get paid much for it.
Sorry, that was an involuntary response.
That's totally fine. Yep, that's what it is. But it's like, I'm doing it right now because that's what I want to be doing. And it brings me things that I didn't know it would bring me, and things that I've been looking for quite some time. So I think I'm like much more tolerant, I guess, to certain things that kind of happen traditionally in academia, where I'm like, oh, that's cool, like that you think it should be done that way. But like at the end of the day, it's going to be my name on the thesis, and I'm going to be the one up there, like at the dissertation, and I'm going to be the one like defending it. So I would prefer that we do it this way. We can compromise on other things, but this particularly, like I really want to do it this way. Can you talked a little bit about like the pushback that you got. Did you ever get pushback, like, because you talked about pushback from academia about what you wanted to do. Did you ever get pushback from fandom?
No, it was quite the opposite. It was people were so excited to be able to tell their story, to share their experiences about fandom and mental health in this kind of structured scientific way. I got the sense that fans also wanted that scientific legitimacy, because it's one of those things where the results of my dissertation, which were talking about, why people come and why people stay, right? So forming relationships and having this sort of non-judgmental fandom culture where people can be themselves, and where we talk about mental health and we use it as coping strategy, all of these wonderful fan works and just all of the things we do. Fans already knew that.
Yeah.
But academia had no idea. So fans were stoked to be able to talk about it. And my results for them were like, obviously. Whereas every academic that I talked to that was outside of fandom was like, this is incredible. I had no idea. So it was very wild, like walking those two worlds at the time. And still, it still is, I have to think about who I'm talking to,
right?
Because the understanding is so vastly, radically different.
You're touching upon something that is like one of the things that is like a research interest of mine, which is like, the fact that academia sometimes comes into communities in order to say the things that this community has been saying for decades, sometimes longer, and then kind of treat it as if it's a discovery of some kind.
Oh,
like,
boy.
oh, we did not know this. And I think that we're starting to have these conversations in like social sciences when it comes to communities like Indigenous communities, Black communities, queer communities. And I think that, the interesting thing about fandom is that like, it is also very much at the margins in many ways. Like it's with different people from different, that come from different intersections of identity. And that's obviously, see, I'm thinking, that's not to say that fandom doesn't also recreate very problematic patterns of oppression. Let's make sure that we put that out there. But fandom in and of itself, I consider very much at the margins. And I think that what you're saying about, oh, this is brand new information is very revealing of that.
Yes. And I will just say too, that I didn't know, like, I will own that I kind of thought I was not necessarily discovering something because I knew it was there, but thinking that I was one of the first people that was going to bring this to light in a scientific way, and then realized that fan studies is a whole academic area, but I didn't even know that. And so I sort of thought I was doing a thing, and then come to discover there's this whole area of study that just is forever overlooked. And I don't know why, because it's so cool. Like, it's so fun. The things they're doing is amazing. And once I discovered that they were there, it was like, I could have done that. Like, so my apologies to everyone in fan studies that I thought that I didn't realize was there, because I know that now that I've been, following that community on Twitter, it seems like every 3 to 6 months, someone thinks they've come in and done something amazing, and fan studies folks are like, yeah, we've been here a while.
Exactly. Oh, welcome. Exactly. Cup of tea. Biscuit, maybe. My introduction to fan studies was through you, actually, really? On Twitter. Yeah, because, I heard you use the term fan studies, and I'm like, that's a thing? What? I knew about media studies. I knew about queer media theory. Like, I knew about, I knew. But fan studies, I didn't know that was a thing. So thank you for that introduction.
You're quite welcome.
And from there, that kind of guided, frankly, like a lot of the readings that I've been doing with regards to like supernatural and like the other stuff that we talk about. But also, like, we're talking about this as if, because we're talking about the problems of academia. But however, having that discussed and published and discussed in academic circles really does provide, quote unquote, evidence of the things that have been said for years. You and I can't change the structure of how the world works. So I think it's important to recognize that, while at the same time saying, like, well, maybe we should just trust the communities and what they're saying. Because there's a lot of wisdom and a lot of knowledge that has gone into that. Do you think that maybe that, like, how do you think that that's linked to the way that, like, fan-run initiatives are treated? So, like, I'm thinking about, like, our podcasts, for example. There's a quote-unquote official podcast going on right now. Do you feel like the treatment by fans and fandom of fan-run initiatives like ours is different?
Yeah. It's such a complicated thing that I've been trying to think about and kind of untangle for myself, even before you and I were going to have this conversation, because I listen to the official podcast. I find it interesting. They do have a different approach in terms of talking to the people who worked on it, which is interesting to see where they were, what they were thinking. At the same time, I think that it's been very obviously framed on social media when they're talking about, like, their Patreon and things like that, that they need to make money to continue to produce the podcast. And on the one hand, I get it. They're professionals. On the other hand, so am I. But we have like a Ko-fi that we just started like a month ago. Most of the time we pay, like we have paid out of our pockets to produce this content because we wanted to, some of it is for us, but we started our podcast in response to the show Supernatural stating that it was ending, and the grief that we saw within the community, and wanting to help in some way, wanting to provide some kind of just community discussion about to validate the grief, because a lot of people were also just judging themselves for being as upset as they were. So, and not understanding where those feelings were coming from. And so for me, it's just I feel like the motivations are different behind the types of podcasts, but I think that, yeah, people can easily dismiss fan-run projects as, well, they're just talking. I mean, anybody can have a podcast. So they just, it's whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And anything that is said by more official channels is, what is.
Yeah, I think it's sort of, it links back to what we were saying about academia and how if it's said by a certain type of person, then it has more value than if it's said by a different type of person. And this is where like my own research interests kind of come in, because one thing that I'm really interested in is Miranda Fricker's concept of epistemic injustice. And I know that I'm using really big words, and I'm going to put the reference for the book in the show notes. The interesting thing about this is the idea basically that like we decide on credible information, on what information we think is credible based on like the information itself, but also the source, right? And we're very, very told to check your sources, make sure that they are that they're valid sources. But I think that the definition that we have of valid sources of information is very narrow, so narrow that we tend to dismiss sometimes people, and this is the crux of Fricker's book, we tend to dismiss people because of prejudices that live in what she calls the social imagination. And that puts people at the margins, women and people of different genders, as well as Black, Indigenous, queer folks, disabled folks, of not being taken as seriously about the information that they're giving, particularly about their own experiences or things that they are competent in, than somebody else who has some kind of different credential. And I only started reflecting on this recently, actually, since this whole spiral about MLA formatting and citation styles, right? It's just crazy that it would lead me to this. But it sort of makes me wonder, like, do we as fan creators have a credibility deficit compared to cast and crew, for example?
Yeah, I think we do. I think that there is an inherent stigma or bias against fans. And I think that even comes through by fans. I think there's that like internalized stigma a lot of the time that can be really tricky to challenge.
Yeah. Do you want to expand on that?
Yeah, I could get on a whole soapbox and just stay there for a real long time. So I'll try to stay relatively succinct. But I think that a lot of fan spaces, certainly our fan space, if we want to talk about supernatural fandom specifically, is very heavily populated by women or those assigned female at birth, whereas the cast and crew is primarily men. And I think that there is a lot of misogyny that goes into fandom, and that's not just supernatural. I think that things that typically are associated with like women or girls is immediately devalued. So whether it's boy bands or romance or soap operas or supernatural, which is, just watching a show about pretty boys.
Which is basically like an amalgam of all of the things that you've just mentioned. Boy bands, yes, romance, and soap operas.
Yeah, very much. Those things are immediately devalued in our society. It's nothing for someone, for a cishet man to paint himself the colors of his team and then go to a sporting event. That is completely socially acceptable. But to cosplay as Castiel and go to a convention would be looked at quite differently by mainstream folks. And so I think that stigma that's not just about fandom, but also about gender, a lot of those things really seep in. They were there for me, and I didn't really even recognize it fully until I was really heavily into the research and the literature review for my research, reading all of these things and going, you're right. Like, what in the world? And so I think that because we have that internalized stigma a lot, I hear so often women especially making themselves smaller, not talking about their fandom because, it's kind of what you described about, I don't want to be judged by it. People aren't going to take it seriously. So I need to this is my, just my silly little thing that I like, but I got to keep it hidden. And that's such a typical thing. And so I think sometimes subconsciously we put that on fandom creators too. Like, well, they're just fans, no matter what expertise they have, no matter how long they've been researching this, no matter what skills they bring to it, like they're just fans.
And I think what's to me the most mind-boggling part about all this is that I've never talked about this actually, but I have a bigger reach with carrying Wayward than I do with all of my published research articles combined.
Oh my goodness, yeah. Oh my goodness, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, same for me and our podcast. I will sit and look at all of the countries that our podcast is being listed. And at first I was like, it must just be like bots or something. There must just be like some glitch in the statistics. No, I'm talking to those folks. They're real.
They're listening.
Yeah. And yeah, it's incredible the difference in terms of information dissemination, like who you are able to reach with this platform versus who is sitting there reading journal articles on
that are often paywalled.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. And that's kind of the thing. Like, I'm really amazed at the way that supernatural podcasts, particularly, like I'm sure that I hope that this also happens in other fandoms, but what I've observed is particular to supernatural, where we've got all of these really good podcasts that are leading conversations within fandom that all contribute to the well-being of this particular community. In a way that I haven't really seen anything else kind of contribute to that. And like my example of that, it's a very personal one, is when I was listening to the Fangirl Business, the first time that you know where I'm going with this. I'm like, oh no. The first episode that I ever listened to of your podcast was the one on the finale. Yeah.
Take a collective deep breath.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, I'm not going to go into the details, but like it is what helped me identify that I was having a trauma response in that moment. And like all of that we were describing, like I was so afraid of talking to anybody in my life about it because like I was afraid of judgment and dismissal and just like, oh, she's, because I was really sad I'm showing my millennial age here, but like I was destroyed by the way that Harry Potter ended. Like there were a lot of things that I didn't love about it, and it just made me so sad. And whenever I had tried to talk to anybody in my life about it, it was just like, ugh, silly teen being upset about her favorite book ending. And the reaction that I was having as a 30-year-old to this silly little like show about angels and demons ending in the way that it did was like tenfold to that. And I felt like I couldn't talk about it to anybody. Like, so there was a lot of like isolation and like silent suffering, which I know is the worst thing you can do to yourself. But listening to you and Catherine like cry in that episode, like just made me feel connected, not only to you and to the rest of the fandom that was experiencing that, but it connected me back to myself. In a way that no like official content ever could really, right? Like, and I'm including like any post-series media that was created via official channels. Like, I don't think anything will help me connect to myself better than this one podcast episode that you and Catherine made, you know?
Well, yeah, I mean, it means so much to hear that, because I think it's going back to your question about navigating personal and professional and fandom, and how, how to move through that. That episode of our podcast, I really questioned, and I still sometimes, I've cried a few times on the podcast, sometimes for good and sometimes for not. And each time I have that moment of sitting and reflecting, like, am I sharing too much? Am I being, because it's not professional. I use that in big quotes.
Yeah.
And specifically in grad school for counseling, we were kind of taught to almost be robots. Even on social media, we're not supposed to share any of ourselves anywhere because it might have a whatever, which is not sustainable and it's not healthy. And so, again, for as much as I use my credentials on the podcast as a lens through which I view things, I needed to just be Chrisha in that moment, and just because I too was having a trauma response that I could not identify, that Catherine had to be like, so, because I was in the same mental place, even though I study it, even though I do clinical work, I still was like, I couldn't possibly be having a trauma response to a television program. Indeed, I was, though, because insert all the reasons here.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I think for me that really, because I wasn't sure, this was right at the time where we had started releasing the very beginning of our episodes, and we didn't really have like a community yet or anything like that. So I felt very like disconnected even from fandom, but that listening to that episode made me, because I wasn't sure if I wanted to continue with this podcast, given like, the shit plate that we had been handed.
Yes, given gesturing wildly. Yes.
Gesturing. But listening to this made me think, okay, you know what? Like if this podcast was able to do this for me, then maybe this is my way of like giving back a little bit, like in my own way. And I know that we've had people come and tell us like, oh, thank you for helping me like Supernatural again. And I'm like, oh, thank you. And I'm sorry, by the way.
Right.
Like, I'm sorry.
Yes.
But yeah, I think that there was just so much like trauma after the ending that I think the way that, and yeah, there were a lot of divisions and difficulties, but I think a lot of people really got together at that time in a way that I don't think I had experienced except in moments of great trauma.
Yeah.
I'm just glad that we were able to be a small part of it,
Yeah. And I think for as much as the fandom has struggled since the finale, which I think we always knew it was going to, because, hiatuses are always when we just sort of, I don't know, the fandom devolves.
Yeah.
But it did, I think, allow for those conversations about the way that fiction and fandom impact mental health.
Absolutely.
And I think that those, for as much as I deeply wish we didn't have to have had them, I do think that they were important and helpful, not just in that context, but like far beyond.
Well, one thing that I've been surprised is that whenever I'm looking for, because I wrote a paper for a class that was about the way that Schitt's Creek was a positive influence on the queer community and non-queer people around them. And I was looking for just that specific thing about how specific media can have an impact when it comes to queerness. And I found so many articles about the 100. But there was nothing about Supernatural in the finale. And I'm wondering, is it too early? Or are people just not touching it, TM? I don't know.
It's interesting. Yeah, I've done some academic talks about it, like roundtable kind of things, but that's a really interesting thing, because I'm sitting here thinking, on our podcast, we did 3 episodes where we broke down and analyzed every step of that godforsaken episode. And it was important. And I think it was necessary for us to understand our own feelings about it, and to share that, I guess, with the community. But it burnt us. Like, we couldn't podcast again for like a year after that, because we were it just sucked all the joy out of all the things. So the idea of writing an academic paper on that, no, thank you.
Yeah. That's so incredibly true, though, because then some people manage it. They manage to academically speak about a topic that is incredibly personal.
Mm-hmm.
I know I can't. I tried. and that one article about Schitt's Creek, and I was focusing on the positive, because the course had been very, what Eve Tuck calls like damage centered, in the sense of like, look at all of these terrible outcomes for these queer kids in school if you do this, that, and the other thing. And I was like, I fully get that. I have lived it. I can't be exposed to this like that, in that way, in a classroom full of people who haven't. And so I focused on the positives, and even that just like drained me of so much of my energy. I was like, oh, okay. So I can talk about certain things that are close to me. I talk about, the intersection of gender, youth, and disability, which is something that is very, hits home for me, but not in the exact way that I have experienced it. Because otherwise, like, I would just not be able to. I would be burnt out after a couple of weeks. So maybe that's what it is. The people who have the interest of talking about it just can't.
Yeah.
I know I couldn't. Too much.
Same.
Is there anything that you'd like to bring up before we come to a close?
One thing I was thinking about in context of this conversation, and what knowledge is quote unquote valid versus not. One of the things that I really took away from my doctoral research beyond fandom was this idea of giving legitimacy to what's called qualitative research, which is talking about people's lived experiences and that being scientifically valid, which is a whole other thing academically, which is that qualitative research is very often devalued and not seen as important as quantitative research, which is all the statistics and the numbers and the harder science. And so when I realized that qualitative research was a thing, it just like shifted my whole outlook, I guess, on knowledge in general, because one of my favorite things about fandom, but also social media, for as much as there's, the negatives, certainly, I have learned more about myself, about the world that I live in, about different people and the experiences of different people from fandom and social media than I ever did in grad school, ever. And it has made me a better person. It's made me a better parent. It's made me a better clinician, to be able to just listen to people and their experiences, instead of, I think, the academic approach of kind of thinking that they know things, and it's that there is a right and a wrong, or that there is a way of being. And I just don't think it's nearly as black and white as academia would love us to believe. I think that there is no such thing as, I don't think that anymore there is any such thing as being a professional that just is completely up to date with everything in their field, because there's simply too much information now. And I think that can really drive imposter syndrome. At least it has for me, because it's like, oh gosh, there's always more I need to know. There's more that I should know. But some of the most valuable work that I have done as a person and a clinician is just talking to people and hearing their experiences, reading fan fiction. I have done whole trainings on the ways that fan fiction can impact mental health, because fan fiction is an art form that is not prettied up for, stakeholders or profit. People can just write their experiences and the dynamics that they're familiar with and give these different outlooks on things that mainstream fiction is never, ever, ever going to give us. Mm-hmm. And so in terms of knowledge, I just cannot state enough how much I have gained from just talking to people and even kind of creeping on Twitter. Twitter is a wonderful place to be able to learn from people learn from conversations you're not a part of, to just be able to sit with other people's experiences, other people's concerns, upset, pain, joy, and reflect on it. And so in terms of knowledge, I feel like I've gotten more out of my fandom experience and social media experiences than I have from academia, frankly.
That's quite relatable. I think part of the reason why I'm in academia right now is because of social media and because I stopped and I listened. This for me started like around the time that my son was born. Because I was at home and I was 25. Most of my friends didn't have children. And so I had to learn to entertain myself. And my way of entertaining myself was to watch old series. Mm-hmm. That's how I started Supernatural in 2016. And to go on social media and read what people had to say. Mm-hmm. And so from there, I was like, wow. I was just amazed at how much I didn't know at the time. Mm-hmm. Now I'm like, oh yeah, no, I know nothing. It's fine. I'm okay with it, right?
That's what I learned in my doctoral program. Yeah. I know nothing except this very hyper-specific topic that I focused on for years.
Exactly. I can talk to you about this thing about hours, but I really know nothing. Just so you know. Let's be very clear.
100%.
Yeah, so I definitely feel that. Chrisha, thank you so much for spending time with me today and having this amazing conversation with me.
Yeah, thank you for thinking of me and inviting me. This is so much fun. And we were reflecting before we started that we've been friends for years, but have never spoken verbally, which is just wild. I don't understand.
That is literally fandom for you.
Yes.
Sometimes I speak with some people that I've talked to on Twitter for some time, either on Discord or something, and I'm like, oh, that's what you sound like.
Right.
That's so cool.
Yes. So yes, this is so amazing to be able to connect and chat and, just talk about this stuff, which there are very few opportunities to really dig into and talk about.
Absolutely. Well, hopefully we can create a bit more space for these kinds of conversations. I think they're very important within our fandom, within our community. Hopefully, they do some good.
Yes.
They help to the well-being of the community. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us where we can find you on social media?
Yes, I am at Dr. Fangirl PhD. So Dr. Fangirl PhD, pretty well everywhere, mostly on Twitter. But I don't know, if you search for it on whatever social media you're on, probably you'll find me.
And where can we find your podcast?
Yes. And the Fangirl Business, we are at the Fangirl Biz, BIZ. And we're kind of mostly on Twitter, I would say. But if you search for the Fangirl Business in any podcasting application, I think we've hit them all at this point.
Wherever we can find podcasts.
Exactly.
Right? That sounds good. Mm-hmm. And you can find us on TikTok, Instagram, Twitter, Hive, and YouTube at Carrying Wayward. And you can become a patron or a supporter by heading to carryingwayward.com. And as always, carry on, our wayward friends.